Every 40 seconds, somewhere on this planet, someone has a stroke. Not someday, not eventually, right now. While you are watching this sentence, another brain is being damaged. 6 million people die from stroke every year. It is the second leading cause of death on Earth and the number one cause of permanent disability. And here is what makes that number so painful. In most cases, the brain tried to warn them first, hours before, sometimes days before. It sent signals, clear, specific, unmistakable signals. They just didn't know what they were looking at. I'm Dr. Victor Kane. I work in preventive medicine. And the single most important thing I can tell you right now is this: a stroke almost never comes out of nowhere. It announces itself. And if you know what that announcement sounds like, you have a window. A real, documented, 72-hour window where the disaster can still be stopped. Stay with me through all 5, because number 3 is the one people most often write off as nothing. And number 5 is the one that kills the most people, because it's the easiest to explain away. Before we start, drop your name and where you're watching from in the comments right now. I read every single one. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, share it before you finish watching. This is the kind of video that saves lives when it reaches the right person at the right time. The 72-hour window. Before I walk you through the 5 warning signs, I need to give you one piece of context, because without it, you might hear these signs and still talk yourself out of taking them seriously. A stroke, specifically an ischemic stroke, which accounts for about 85% of all strokes, doesn't usually happen in an instant. It is almost always the final step in a process that took years. Arteries narrowing, plaques building, blood flow tightening through corridors that used to be wide open. And along that road, the brain sends out early warnings. Medicine has a name for them: transient ischemic attacks, TIAs. The word transient just means temporary. The symptom comes, then it goes. And because it goes, most people do the most dangerous thing possible. They decide it was nothing. What the research actually shows is that a TIA very often precedes a major stroke, typically within the next 72 hours. Those 3 days are your window. The window where intervention can still change the outcome. Most people don't use that window, because the warning was brief and strange, and then it went away on its own. I want to make sure that doesn't happen to you. Warning sign number 1: temporary blindness in one eye. I want to tell you about a man I'll call Frank, 67 years old, retired electrician from a small town in Pennsylvania. Strong man, practical man, the kind who fixed problems himself before calling anyone else. He was in his kitchen one morning making coffee when his left eye went dark. Not blurry, dark. Like someone had pulled a black curtain over it. He blinked. He rubbed his eye. Within 30 seconds, it was gone. Frank told himself he'd stood up too fast. He poured his coffee. He didn't mention it to anyone for 3 weeks. 11 days after that morning in the kitchen, Frank's wife found him on the bathroom floor. He could not speak. He could not move his right arm. He survived. But the man who came home from the hospital was not the man who had gone in. Here is what was happening in Frank's kitchen that morning. A tiny fragment of plaque had broken off from the wall of his carotid artery, the main artery in the neck that carries blood from the heart up to the brain. That fragment traveled upward and briefly blocked the small artery that feeds the retina of his eye. The retina lost its blood supply for 30 seconds. Frank saw darkness. Then the fragment drifted, blood flow returned, and the vision came back. What Frank didn't know, what nobody had ever told him, was that the artery feeding his eye is a direct branch of the same artery feeding his brain. That fragment missed his brain by millimeters. The next one didn't. Neurologists have a name for what Frank experienced: amaurosis fugax, fleeting blindness. When a patient describes this in a clinical setting, it is treated like a fire alarm. Urgent evaluation, immediate imaging. Because hospital records show a consistent pattern. People who ignore 2 or 3 of these episodes and then experience the major stroke on the 3rd or 4th. If your vision in one eye goes dark, gray, or foggy, even for 30 seconds, even if it completely resolves, that is not a fluke. That is your brain sending its first warning. Warning sign number 2. Sudden numbness or tingling on one side. I want to tell you about a woman I'll call Patricia, 71 years old, retired nurse from a suburb outside of Atlanta. She knew more about medicine than most patients ever do. She had managed other people's health crises for 30 years. One afternoon, she was sitting at her kitchen table reading when her right hand went numb. Not the gentle pins and needles of a hand fallen asleep. A sudden, deep, strange numbness. Like the hand had been replaced with something that looked like her hand, but didn't feel like it. It lasted 4 minutes. Then it was gone. Patricia, who had spent her career watching patients dismiss symptoms, told herself she had probably been leaning on her arm. She did not call anyone. She did not write it down. She went back to her book. 2 days later, she had a stroke that affected the left side of her brain. Here is what was happening while Patricia was reading. Stroke symptoms are almost always one-sided, because each hemisphere of the brain controls and receives sensation from the opposite side of the body. The part of Patricia's brain that maps sensation from her right hand had briefly lost blood flow. Not the hand itself, the brain. When blood flow returned, sensation came back. When she dismissed it, she lost her window. The critical distinction: when you sleep on your arm and it goes numb, the problem is in the arm. A compressed nerve, restricted blood flow to the limb itself. It clears up when you move, usually within a minute or 2. A TIA-related numbness is different. It comes out of nowhere, while you are sitting still, walking normally, in the middle of a sentence. It is sudden, complete, and one-sided. And it has nothing to do with how you were positioned. If both hands go numb evenly, that more often points to a neck or spine issue. But sudden, one-sided numbness that resolves after a few minutes, that is a reason to be evaluated. Not next week, the same day. Warning sign number 3. Sudden loss of coordination. This is the one people most commonly explain away. I want to tell you about a man I'll call Raymond, 64 years old, retired high school principal from a mid-sized city in Ohio. Sharp, organized, a man who had never missed a scheduled appointment in his adult life. He was walking down his own hallway, a hallway he had walked 10,000 times, when his left leg simply didn't land where it was supposed to. He staggered into the wall, grabbed the door frame. He stood there for a moment, steadied himself, and then kept walking. Raymond told his wife he must be coming down with something. He went to bed early. He felt fine the next morning. 3 days later, he woke up and couldn't stand up from the bed without falling. Here is what was happening in Raymond's hallway. At the base of your skull, sitting low and back like a small extra brain, is a structure called the cerebellum. It is responsible for coordination, balance, and the smooth execution of movement. It calculates constantly where your body is in space, how hard each muscle should fire, how to land a footstep correctly on a familiar surface. The cerebellum gets its blood supply from arteries that run up through the bones of the neck into the back of the head. When blood flow in those arteries drops, even briefly, the cerebellum essentially glitches. That is when you veer sideways on flat ground, when your leg doesn't land where your brain told it to, when a sudden violent spinning sensation hits you from nowhere, even though you didn't move your head. Benign dizziness almost always has a clear trigger. Rolling over in bed, turning your head quickly, a known inner ear condition. What I'm describing is different. Spontaneous, sudden loss of coordination or intense dizziness with no obvious trigger, especially if it is accompanied by any other symptom on this list, should be treated as a possible TIA until a doctor rules out a vascular cause. Raymond wrote it off as tiredness. He lost 3 days of his window. If you're still with me and this is landing, go ahead and type the number 3 in the comments right now. Warning sign number 4. Sudden breakdown in speech. I need to be precise about something before I describe this one. If you occasionally lose a word mid-sentence or temporarily blank on something common, that is not a stroke warning. That is a normal tip-of-the-tongue moment. It happens more when you're tired. It is not what I'm describing. What I'm describing is something you would not mistake for a normal moment. I want to tell you about a woman I'll call Helen, 69 years old, a retired English professor. A woman who had spent her career choosing words with precision. She was on the phone with her daughter when she suddenly could not finish a sentence. The words were there in her mind. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. But what came out of her mouth was broken, fragmented sounds that weren't the words she intended. It lasted about 6 minutes. Then her speech came back completely. Helen told her daughter it must have been a bad connection. She was embarrassed. She didn't bring it up again. 4 days later, she had a stroke that permanently affected her ability to read. Here is what was happening on that phone call. There are 2 primary speech areas in most people's brains, both typically in the left hemisphere. Broca's area handles the formation and production of words. When that region loses blood flow, you may understand everything around you perfectly, know exactly what you want to say, but be unable to produce the words correctly. They come out slurred, fragmented, or stuck. Wernicke's area handles the comprehension and organization of language. When that region is affected, a person may speak fluently, but produce complete nonsense, words that don't connect into meaning, and may not understand speech directed at them. Either of these, appearing suddenly and then resolving, is a classic TIA presentation. Not tiredness, not a bad connection. Your brain's language center briefly lost its blood supply. Helen was embarrassed enough to dismiss it. That embarrassment cost her 4 days of her window. Sudden speech breakdown, even if it self-corrects in minutes, is not something you explain away. It is your brain's most direct possible message that something is wrong. Warning sign number 5. Sudden, severe headache, unlike any you've had before. This is the one that kills the most people, because headaches are so common that we have all learned to tolerate them. I want to tell you about a man I'll call Gerald, 72 years old, retired firefighter from a small city in Texas. A man who had spent his career running toward danger, not easily frightened, not a complainer. He was watching television one evening when a headache hit him. Not a dull ache, not tension across the forehead. A sudden, violent, explosive pain at the back of his head. A pain so intense and so unlike anything he had ever felt before that he told his wife it felt like something had gone off inside his skull. It eased slightly after 20 minutes. Gerald took 2 aspirin and went to bed. He did not wake up. Here is what was happening. What Gerald experienced has a name that neurologists use specifically: a thunderclap headache. A headache that reaches maximum intensity within seconds. Sudden, explosive, unlike anything before it. In a significant number of cases, a thunderclap headache is the first and only warning sign of a hemorrhagic stroke, specifically a subarachnoid hemorrhage. where a blood vessel on the surface of the brain ruptures and bleeds into the space around it. This is different from the ischemic strokes we've been discussing. This is a vessel that has burst. And the characteristic warning it sends is that single, sudden, catastrophic headache. Here is the critical detail. Gerald took aspirin. In an ischemic stroke, where a vessel is blocked, blood thinners can sometimes help. In a hemorrhagic stroke, where a vessel is already bleeding, they make it worse, faster, larger. There is no way to know which type of stroke is occurring without brain imaging. No doctor can tell by looking at someone, which is exactly why a sudden, severe, first-of-its-kind headache, the worst headache of your life, requires emergency evaluation. Not aspirin, not sleep, a CT scan. Your 72-hour protocol. If you have experienced any of these 5 warning signs, even once, even briefly, even months ago, here is what you do. Write it down. Today. In plain language. The date, what you felt, how long it lasted, and what you were doing when it happened. Do not rely on memory. Memory compresses and softens over time. A written account gives your doctor something real to work with. Tell someone. If you live alone, this is especially important. The 72 hours after a suspected TIA are the highest risk period. You need another person who knows what happened, can see if something changes, and can act if you suddenly can't. Do not drive yourself to evaluation. Losing vision or arm control for even a few seconds at highway speed is life-threatening for you and everyone around you. Make a plan now, before you ever need it, for how you would get to care without getting behind the wheel. Do not self-medicate. There are 2 types of stroke, ischemic and hemorrhagic. Blood thinners can help in certain ischemic situations and actively worsen hemorrhagic ones. The only way to know which type you're dealing with is brain imaging. Ask your doctor in advance what they want you to do if this ever happens. Get a specific answer. Write it down. If your blood pressure reads 180 systolic or higher with 110 diastolic or higher, that is a hypertensive crisis, not just elevated pressure. Call emergency services. Don't wait. 3 tests to ask your doctor about. The first is a carotid duplex ultrasound. This shows both the structure of your neck arteries and how blood is actually flowing through them, including whether flow speeds up and becomes turbulent at a narrowed segment. If the carotid artery is narrowed by more than roughly 70%, that narrowing alone is enough to seriously impair blood flow to the brain. That changes the urgency of the conversation significantly. The second is a glycated hemoglobin test, HbA1c. This is not a snapshot of today's blood sugar. It reflects your average blood sugar over the past 3 months. It is specifically good at catching prediabetes, the gray zone where sugar has been high enough, long enough to damage vessel walls for years before anyone officially labels it as a problem. The third is Holter monitoring, a 24-hour heart rhythm recording. Atrial fibrillation, the heart rhythm problem most strongly linked to stroke, often comes and goes. A 10-second ECG in a clinic can miss it entirely. A full day of continuous monitoring catches what a snapshot cannot. And if atrial fibrillation is found, there are well-studied medications that can reduce stroke risk in that condition by 60 to 70%. That is not an inevitable outcome. That is a risk you and your cardiologist can actively work on together. I want to leave you with something I mean completely. Stroke is not a lightning bolt from a clear sky. It is a predictable event. It follows years of damage that almost always announces itself before the catastrophe arrives. Frank's black curtain in the kitchen. Patricia's numb hand at the table. Raymond staggering in his own hallway. Helen's broken words on the phone. Gerald's thunderclap in the evening. Every one of them had a window. Every one of them lost it. Not because they were careless people, not because they didn't care about their health, but because nobody had ever sat down with them and said, "This is what it looks like. This is what it means. And this is what you do when it happens." Now you know. If you recognize any of these warning signs from your own life, even from months ago, write them down today and bring that list to your doctor. Ask specifically about TIA evaluation. Ask about carotid ultrasound, HbA1c, and Holter monitoring. You don't need to panic. You need to act. Subscribe if this video gave you something you needed. I'm here every single week with the kind of honest, specific, evidence-based conversation that a 15-minute appointment rarely has room for. And share this video right now before you close it. Because somewhere in your life there is a Frank, a Patricia, a Raymond, a Helen, or a Gerald, and they need to see this before their window opens. Take good care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.